In order for you as teachers to play a role in preserving and supporting the seeds of this earth, it's important to acknowledge and comprehend some foundational concepts behind the art, science, and practice of saving seeds as a template for learning. Let's start off with the most important question. Why? Why save seeds? Saving seeds makes economic sense. It fabricates the very foundational elements of life. I mean, when you think about it, the food we eat, the water we drink, the wood for the shelters and houses we live in, the air we breathe, seeds play a role in all of that. Seed saving preserves plant heritage, genetics, culture, and biodiversity. It can help save our pollinators because while we're waiting for seeds to form on the plants, those flowers are providing an invaluable source of food for our pollinators. It plays a crucial role in plant adaptation, and it really gives you freedom of choice in the kitchen. It also can build community through seed sharing. I think it's really important that we remind ourselves of this why, for it keeps us connected to the intention behind our actions. So to grow a plant from seed to seed, there are two main steps involved. The first step is seed production, and seed production really defines the planning, practice, and art of growing seed. This includes planting, weeding, spacing, and continual maintenance. Today, the lives of many gardens end here, where fruits and vegetables are harvested to be eaten, and which often cuts the cycle of the seed short. The second step in this cycle is the technical process of saving seeds. This entails the removal of fruit from the plant at a proper time, quickly followed by various methods of cleaning, drying, and storing seed. Today, we'll be focused on the second step, but not without context from the first. So let's talk about the vocabulary, cycles, and processes that are a part of seed production. When growing plants for seed, you will treat your plants differently depending on their species, place of origin, and population status. Because we are focused on food production and ecological preservation, I will be referring to both natives and non-natives throughout this presentation. So generally, when growing vegetables, flowers, or herbs for seed production, we are focused on preservation, which is the process of maintaining genetic diversity and genetic purity within a specific variety so that its expression remains true to type for the next generation. On the other hand, when you're growing a small lot of native plants, you may encourage some form of hybridization between native varieties within the same species to increase genetic diversity within the population. This is known as genetic restoration, which is important because of the fact that many native plants here on the Hawaiian Islands are faced with a bottleneck. This bottleneck is a limited gene pool in a small population with an extensive history of inbreeding. So in the field of seed production, there are a few terms that must be understood, including the distinction between different labels you will often find in a seed catalog when purchasing flowers, vegetables, and herbs. These labels classify open pollinated, heirloom, and hybrid varieties. An open pollinated variety is a seed variety that, when allowed to cross-pollinate with other members of the same population, will produce offspring that are true to type. This means that the child plant will express traits similar to their parent. Because there is no restriction on the flow of pollen between individuals, open pollinated plants are more genetically diverse, leading to an amazing variation within plant populations, which over time allows them to adapt to local growing conditions and climates. One example of an open pollinated variety here in Hawaii is the Lua Lua Lei pole bean, developed here by UH plant breeders during the 1940s in response to a rust fungus that was attacking the most popular variety at the time, which was the Kentucky Wonder pole bean. Last year, the Lua pole bean was made available on the Hawaii Seed Growers Network marketplace and is actually still there today for any of you who are interested. The second seed you may find in the seed catalog is an heirloom variety. An heirloom variety is an open pollinated cultivar that has been grown and shared from generation to generation within a family or community. Certain sources state that an heirloom seed must be at least a few decades old, some dating back to 5 decades or more. But in the end, an heirloom seed always has a face, place, and story embedded into the timeline of their rich history. It is said that in plantation times, bringing seeds was like bringing the next generation to work because those seeds would feed both the immigrants and their children. When plantation workers would come over from other countries and continents around the world to the sugarcane plantations, they carried seeds with them in their luggage and even in their shoes between their toes. When they arrived, they would plant those seeds and grow a piece of home to share with everyone else in the plantation village. In the late 1900s, many heirloom vegetable varieties could be found growing in the gardens of plantation descendants. Today, most of these varieties have been lost, though, along with their stories. But the good news is that there are still some that exist, maybe even hidden in your neighbor's backyard. So I encourage you all to take a peek. Maybe you'll find something precious. The third type of seed you will find in a seed catalog, potentially, is a hybrid seed. Hybrid seed is a product of crosses between the two different varieties of the same species of plant. The first generation of hybridized seed is called F1 or Philo 1 and tends to either produce a higher yield or grow better because of a specific trait that has been selected. Seeds produced from F1 plants are unstable and will not produce true to type, but eventually hybrid seed can be stabilized into an open pollinated variety over a long repetitive process of growing and selection. Oftentimes, you will hear discouraging messages against the practice of saving seeds from hybrid plants, but as long as you know that you really don't know what you're going to get, it can actually be quite exciting. Just last year, in fact, Seeds of Honua launched a project in partnership with UH-CTAR centered around growing out hybrid crosses. We engaged a cohort of gardeners across the state of Hawaii who grew and selected individual tomato plants best adapted to their specific growing conditions. Inspiration from this project came from Dr. Jim Myers, who is a vegetable plant breeder at the Oregon State University. And he has been, for a couple of years now, actually developing new tomato varieties in collaboration with Glenn Tevez, who is a UH extension agent on Molokai. One recent variety was a UH grape Komohana crossed with one of Jim's new varieties, Indigo Kiwi, a green when ripe tomato. Glenn grew out the F1 generation, which predictably expressed uniform traits similar to the yellow tomato on the screen. The F2 seeds saved from this hybrid were later sent out across the state and only a few months later expressed their diverse traits in the following ways. Wow, I mean, look at all this diversity. It's really crazy to think that all these different tomatoes sprouted from the same collection of seed, which came from a second generation hybrid cross of two parent plants. It was the yellow tomato you saw at the previous slide. I don't know about you, but I love the purple one in the top center of the screen. In addition to vocabulary, seed production also involves a little taxonomy. The mnemonic device for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species is King Philip came over for great seeds. Some science teachers like to say King Philip came over for great soup or great spaghetti, but I put in great seeds. And while it's important to note King Philip, we don't really need to include him or why he came over. All we care for as seed savers are, of course, the great seeds, or the genus and species. Now, that was meant to be a joke, so I don't want to confuse anyone. To put it briefly, all plants have a Latin name, which is given to them based on their lineage and flower structure. This means that plants within the same scientific kind of group, plants that have the same scientific name rather, are closely related and thus have the ability to cross-pollinate or share pollen. Therefore, if you know the scientific name of your crop type in relation to others, you will be able to determine what will and what won't cross-pollinate if grown in your school garden at the same time. Take, for example, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, kale, and kohlrabi. While you may suspect that these crops are incompatible, seeing as though they possess such distinct characteristics, they're all varieties of the Brassica oleracea species, meaning they actually can share pollen. Such an event would result in the development of a hybrid seed rather than a seed that remains true to type. But who knows? Maybe a Braca flower could be the next best thing, like the labradoodle of the plant world. As this applies to natives, once again, cross-pollination is not as much of a concern, but there are a few scenarios that conservationists frown upon, such as the flow of pollen between native and invasive species of plants, to produce hybrids, which among others are relatively or readily observed in our sandalwood populations, our native wood sandal populations. So just like a species can include several crop types, as presented in the previous example, one crop type can include several different species. On the screen, you'll see 4 species: Cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita agrospermia, Cucurbita moschata, and Cucurbita maxima. My question to you all is, can these squash species cross-pollinate with one another? For all of those who answered no, you are correct, because generally plants within the same species, same genus, right, has the same genus, it's Cucurbita, but it's a different species. We have pepo, agrospermia, moschata, maxima. So generally plants within the same genus, but different species will not cross-pollinate. This means that you actually could be growing zucchini, silver seed squash, acorn squash, and kabocha squash at the same time with little possibility of cross-contamination. I know that is a bit confusing, but over time, you'll get it. Again, especially for natives, there are exceptions to these rules, as interspecific hybridization has been demonstrated in Ohia lehua, for example, meaning cross-pollination can occur between members of different Ohia species. But many scientists believe that that's kind of a result of the Ohia currently going through what's called an adaptive radiation right before our eyes. So it's just evolution playing out right before our eyes. I think that's pretty interesting. Moving on to plant life cycles. So a plant can have one of 3 life cycles, depending on when it produces flower, fruit, and seed. One is annual, the other is biannual, and the last is perennial. So annual plants are plants that perform their entire life cycle in a single growing season. This means that they flower, set seeds, and die within 1 year. Lettuce, peas, beans, those are all good examples. Biennial plants don't flower or produce seed until their second growing season, after a period of vernalization, which is basically a time where plants are exposed to temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 8 to 12 weeks. Now, these plants are not guaranteed to produce seed in Hawaii because of our warm weather. So many biennials, such as collards, turn into partial perennials. Again, kale, beets, carrots, collards, those are all examples of biennials. A perennial plant is a long-living plant or tree that flowers, fruits, and seeds for multiple growing seasons. This is the most common life cycle for native plants. A general rule of thumb for beginner seed savers when saving seeds from vegetables, herbs, and flowers is to select annuals that are primarily self-pollinating as a starter seed crop. There is still research going into tropical seed production for species that require vernalization, but breakthroughs have occurred, and there are some biennial vegetable varieties that have been adapted to tropical climates, capable of growing both roots, shoots, and seed in the same season. One example of this is a carrot variety known as Uberlandia. And for any of you who are interested, I think they are offering this variety in some seed catalogs. So we really can't talk about a plant's life cycle without pulling this magic school bus into the station of pollination. Flower morphology and pollination biology is a beautiful puzzle. First, let's break it apart piece by piece with some definitions. In one flower, you'll often find one or two reproductive organs. One is called the stamen and the other is called the pistil. The stamen is a pollen-producing reproductive organ of a flower, typically consisting of a pollen-containing anther and a supportive filament, which actually will hold up the anther. These are the thread-like structures that suspend the anther you see on the screen. The pistil is a reproductive organ at the center of the flower, usually composed of an ovary, style, and stigma. The stigma is the swollen structure at the top of the pistil, which captures the pollen grains, and the style is that kind of straw-like tube you see leading down from the stigma to the ovary, and the ovary is this enlarged basal portion of the pistil that contains one or more ovules, which develop into seeds. Finally, pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. And this can happen in multiple ways. So there are two general flower classifications. One is perfect flowers and the other is imperfect flowers. So perfect flowers contain both a stamen and a pistil. Beans, peppers, tomatoes, and lettuce are a few examples of crops with perfect flowers. Elema and hibiscus are a few examples of natives that possess perfect flowers. Some plants with perfect flowers can perform self-pollination. Actually, most plants with perfect flowers can. This is a process where pollen from an anther is transferred to the stigma within the same flower on the same plant. Some plants have specific mechanisms for ensuring self-pollination. In beans, pollen transfer happens within a flower before it even opens. Other plants that obtain perfect flowers have mechanisms for ensuring cross-pollination within their flowers. And this means that they're often self-incompatible. And this is actually the case for a lot of our natives, because as I mentioned, they have an extensive history of inbreeding. So moving on to the second category or classification of flowers, we have imperfect flowers. Imperfect flowers possess only one type of reproductive organ, either stamens or pistils. Examples of crops with imperfect flowers include corn, squash, arugula, and cilantro. Mamaki is an example of a native plant with an imperfect flower. These flowers require cross-pollination. And cross-pollination is basically a process where pollen must be transferred by insects or wind between flowers with anthers to flowers with pistils in order for the fruit and seed to be produced. Now, in seed saving, these definitions have an application to the process of observation. When observing the structure and parts of a flower on your plants, you can often tell how they are pollinated. Of course, you could also look this up, but observation is the very best tool. For within a population, there's always variation. For example, the tomato plant is recognized as one that can perform self-pollination. But just because a plant can perform self-pollination doesn't mean it won't cross-pollinate if it gets the chance. If we reference the picture on the screen, do you guys see a difference in the two flowers? And if you see now, the red circles kind of highlight it, but there are different kind of structures of the reproductive parts there. We can see that the anthers of the flower to the right are actually fused around a sunken stigma. And this structural design actually makes it easier for self-pollination to occur. But the flower on the left has an exerted stigma, which means it's more likely to cross-pollinate because the stigma is exposed. Now, if you want to produce seed that is true to type, this can affect the population density, which is the amount of plants you have, and the isolation distance, which is the distance between different varieties of your crop. Depending on the type of plant, seed production may actually take a bit longer and may take up more space, and it may take a bit more thought than vegetable production. Some important factors to consider include the following. Time and space is one of them. Plants grown for fruit, such as tomatoes, beans, and melons, don't require additional space and time when being grown out for seed, because the fruit is the same thing you would harvest, right? But in contrast, plants grown for their roots, stems, and leaves, such as lettuce, broccoli, and spinach, often surpass their size as vegetable crops and will require several more months in the ground to mature. If you grow in containers, you may also need a larger sized container to provide enough nutrients and space for the plant to grow and produce seed. You'll also need some support. The larger your plants get, the more support they will need when producing seed. Staking or trellising will increase airflow to keep your plants from falling over, and this will also prevent disease and aid in the drying of dry-seeded crops. Weeds and disease are another things you want to take into account because most plants are, again, left in the ground longer. They will be exposed to weeds, pests, and disease, and you'll just want to take normal measures for addressing that. This can, include weeding and spraying natural pest deterrents and other precautions that you'll normally take when growing a garden. You'll also need to take into account something that is known as isolation distance. I mentioned this in the previous slide, but in order to maintain a specific variety's distinctive traits, some isolation distance between varieties of the same species is needed to prevent unwanted cross-pollination. Different crop varieties that, again, share the same scientific name must be isolated throughout space or time to maintain a variety's integrity. And then we'll also talk a little bit about population density. So in order to produce viable seed, some crops need other plants to share pollen with. Again, this is the cross-pollinated types of crops, which often have imperfect flowers, whereas other crops can produce seed with just a single plant. And remember, this is plants that usually have perfect flowers. If the amount of plants or population size within a population is quite small, genetic diversity can actually be lost along with an increase or decrease in certain traits such as vigor. Population density goes hand in hand with population. So this means that self-pollinating crops often require less population size to produce viable seed, whereas cross-pollinating crops will need larger population density. To summarize this pretty compact segment relating to the effective management of a seed garden, I suggest really familiarizing yourself with the design of your seed garden, the weather of your bioregion, and the plants that you are growing or hope to grow. When it comes to seed maturity, there is a difference between eating ripe and seed ripe. In order to have viable seed, you have to wait until the seeds are fully ripe and before you harvest them, because if picked from the plant too early, many of the seeds will not germinate because they haven't developed. So some crops have seeds that are ready to harvest when the fruit is also ready to eat, such as peppers and tomatoes. Wait until these fruits have ripened to their fullest expression of color before harvesting. Other crops, such as beans, lettuce, and eggplant, cucumber, and okra, sometimes broccoli, as well as many others, often require a longer time growing on the plant beyond the stage of market maturity. Crops like beans and okra should dry on the plant and harden until they are brown, while crops such as eggplants and cucumbers should be left on the vine until they are overripe, but not yet rotten. Wow, we've discussed quite a bit. I mean, where are we now in our seed journey? To review, we know the labels of a seed market, from open pollinated plants to hybrids and heirlooms. We know the relevancy of genus and species. We understand to a certain extent a plant's life cycle. We can identify flower types, imperfect and perfect flowers. And we can draw conclusions on how plant pollination works in relation to their flower structures. We also know the points of planning to focus on in our seed gardens, and we know when and how to harvest our fruits and vegetables when seed saving. Now it's time to process these fruits, pods, capsules, and seed heads.